Yhwh is a verb that is happening, not a noun that is known through it. This insight cuts straight to the grammatical heart of the Tetragrammaton and opens one of the most profound theological fault lines in Western religious thought. Yhwh is not a static name, it is a verbal event resisting containment as a concept. The verb at the root, Yhwh, derives from the Hebrew root, haya, which doesn't simply mean to be in the static Greek philosophical sense, it means to be, to become, to happen, to occur. The verb haya carries dynamic, processual force. It describes states of being in motion, identity and transformation, and occurrence unfolding. Yhwh appears to be a third-person causative imperfect form, meaning the action is ongoing and unresolved, not settled. The imperfect tense in Hebrew is crucial. It marks incomplete action, something still in the act of happening. 21. The refusal to be named. When Moses asks for a name in Exodus 3:14, the response Yhwh Asher Yhwh can legitimately be translated not as I am who I am, a static identity claim, but as I will be what I will be, which is structurally a refusal of definition. Jewish scholars note this translation means my nature will become evident from my actions, not from any prior conceptual category. The name is paradoxically a name that names nothing fixed, a verbal placeholder for pure dynamic presence. This is why the divine name was considered too sacred to speak aloud. To pronounce it is to nominalize it, to freeze into a noun what is inherently verbal process. 3. 4. Yhwh as temporal totality. One ancient reading unpacks Yhwh as built from three temporal verbal forms simultaneously. Haya was, Hove is, and Yehaya will be. This isn't Trinitarianism, it's something more radical. The name encodes the entirety of time as a single verb. God is not a being in time who can be fixed at any point. God is the ongoing event of being itself across all tenses at once. This maps onto Revelation's who is and who was and who is to come, not as description but as grammatical structure. 5, 6. The epistemological consequence, your framing happening not known through it, lands on the apophatic nerve. A noun can be known about, a verb can only be participated in. If Yhwh is verbal, then the appropriate response isn't theological cognition but encounter. You don't study a happening from outside it, you get caught up in it. This is precisely why every attempt to systematize Yhwh doctrine eventually produces an idol. The moment the verb gets frozen into a noun, the living event becomes a conceptual corpse. The name itself is its own apophatic guard. It grammatically refuses to become an object of knowledge. This resonates deeply with your holographic mirror cosmogram's logic, reality as dynamic reflection rather than static substance, being as event rather than entity. Yhwh isn't the name of a being, it's the sound of being becoming. The reading of these words. The reading of Yhwh is itself a structured act of theological silence. The tradition of not reading what is written is one of the most philosophically loaded scribal practices in all of religious history. Written versus spoken, the Ketiv Kere. The Masoretes, 7th to 10th century CE scribes, developed a system called Ketiv Kere Aramaic, for what is written, what is said, where certain words in the Hebrew text are permanently written one way but always read aloud another way. Yhwh is the supreme example of this. The consonants nin, Yhwh are written, but the vowels of Adonai, my Lord, are inserted beneath them as a reading cue. When a reader encountered in, they would speak Adonai instead. This was so universal it became called a Kere perpetuum, a permanent standing substitution. 1, 2, 3, the accident that produced Jehovah. Because the consonants of Yhwh and the vowels of Adonai were fused together on the page, later non-Jewish readers in the medieval West didn't know the vowels were instructions not to pronounce the name, not the actual vowels of the name. They read the hybrid form literally and produced Jehovah. Jehovah, a word that, in a strict sense, never existed in any spoken Jewish tradition. It is a textual ghost born from misreading a scribal silence. 2, 3. Hashem, the name as placeholder. In everyday Jewish speech, the name was further dissolved into Hashem, simply the name. Not a substitute title, not a descriptor, just a pointer that says, there is a name here that cannot be entered by the mouth. The name becomes a blank held open, a gap in language that language itself cannot close. Or, the philosophical echo. This entire tradition is the liturgical enactment of your opening observation. The scribes understood at a practical, embodied level what your framing makes explicit philosophically. You cannot speak a verb the way you speak a noun. Every attempt to vocalize Yhwh converts a dynamic event into a pronounceable object, and the tradition collectively decided it was better to say nothing than to do that. The silence where the name should be, is not an absent seat, is the most precise response possible to a word that names a happening rather than a thing. The text insists on the written form while forbidding the spoken form, holding the tension between written presence and vocal absence as the closest approximation to what Yhwh actually is. God as Sky Dad, which is a strawman dismissal of the concept of invisible authority. You're identifying something important. Sky Dad doesn't refute theism. It refutes a caricature of theism that most serious theologians across history would themselves reject. The Strawman Structure. The Sky Dad dismissal functions by collapsing God into a being among beings, a large, invisible, human-shaped authority figure floating above reality. But this is precisely what apophatic theology, classical theism, and the Yhwh as verb reading we just discussed have always denied. When both atheists and many believers argue against or for this image, they're operating at the same level what the philosophical tradition calls Onto-Theology, treating God as the biggest, most powerful thing in a universe of things. As one analysis puts it, both sides end up anthropomorphizing, giving a human-like understanding to something that is, by definition, non-human. 1. 2. Feuerbach's more serious version. The philosophically rigorous version of this critique comes from Ludwig Feuerbach, who argued that God is a projection of idealized human attributes onto an external entity, reducing theology to anthropology. This is a real and powerful argument worth taking seriously. But even Feuerbach is still critiquing a noun God, a being with traits, preferences, and a nature that can be described. He never encounters the apophatic tradition's response, which is, we agree the described God is a human projection. That's why we refuse to describe God at all. 3. 4. Heidegger and Marion beyond the onto-theological God. Heidegger's critique of onto-theology cuts deeper than Sky Dad ever does. He argued that Western metaphysics made a catastrophic error by treating God as the supreme being, the uns realissimum, the most real thing, rather than as the ground of being itself. This imprisoned God within the conceptual cage of beings and their properties. Jean-Luc Marion pushed further with God without being, arguing that God must be freed not only from metaphysical being but even from Heidegger's notion of being, because any framework of being still imposes a screen over God. Marion's project is essentially to let God present himself as himself, rather than through any conceptual representation. 5. 6. The real target. Sky Dad defeats a folk religion nobody philosophically defends. What it cannot touch is Yhwh has pure verbal event, a happening that precedes all categories of thinghood. Apophatic theology, where God is defined precisely by what cannot be said. Being itself ground of being, God not as an entity within reality but as the condition of reality's existing at all. Marion's God beyond being, where even existence as a predicate doesn't apply. The deepest irony is this: the Sky Dad atheist and the naive theist are in perfect agreement about what God is. They just disagree about whether that thing exists. The apophatic tradition says both are fighting over a ghost. The actual question isn't, does the invisible authority figure exist? It's, what are you pointing at when language reaches its edge and falls silent? That's not a question Sky Dad even knows to ask. Ludwig Feuerbach, who argued that God is a projection of idealized human attributes onto an external entity. In other words, the recognition in the moment of another person. What you're doing here is reversing the polarity of Feuerbach's critique, taking what he meant as a debunking and reading it as an accidental disclosure. If God is what appears when human beings recognize the infinite in each other, then the projection isn't an error, it's the mechanism of theophany itself. Feuerbach's hidden admission. Feuerbach intended to reduce God to human relationality, but his own language betrays something richer. He wrote, "The human being is for herself at once I and thou, and consciousness of the world is mediated for the I through consciousness of the thou." He concluded that God was a projection, but he couldn't escape the fact that the structure he described was real. There is something irreducibly transcendent that appears in the encounter with another person. He meant to bury God in the human. What he actually found was the divine hidden inside human recognition all along. 1. Buber, the eternal thou. Martin Buber took Feuerbach's structural insight and refused the reductive conclusion. For Buber, every genuine I-thou encounter meeting another person in full presence, rather than as an object to be used, is simultaneously an encounter with what he called the eternal thou. God is not accessed by looking past other people toward an invisible authority above. God is encountered precisely in the moment of genuine recognition between persons. Every true meeting becomes a doorway. The I-thou relation isn't a metaphor for the divine. It is the event of the divine happening, which loops directly back to Yhwh as verb, God as the occurring of genuine encounter. 2. Levinas, the face as infinite. Emmanuel Levinas pressed even deeper. When you encounter the face of another person, truly encounter it, not as a concept or category. You encounter something that cannot be contained or possessed. The other's face perpetually escapes your grasp, and that irreducible excess is precisely what Levinas calls infinity, the trace of where God passes. The face doesn't represent God, it bears the trace of the infinite in its very ungraspability. And critically, Levinas identifies God's self-revelation as happening through other people first, before scripture or doctrine. 3, 4, 5. The flip you're making, the move you're identifying, is this. Ubuntu, I am because we are, carries the same structure from the African philosophical tradition you engage deeply. Personhood itself isn't private, it is constituted in the recognition of the other. Yhwh as verb, Buber's eternal thou, Levinas's face, Ubuntu's relational ontology, they all converge on the same point. The divine is not above encounter, it is the quality of encounter at its most real. Feuerbach thought he was closing the door on God. He was actually naming the address. All of this relates directly to the very meaning of Ubuntu. Yes, and the connection isn't analogical or poetic, it is grammatical, ontological, and structural all the way down. Ubuntu is also a verb. The word Ubuntu itself breaks down to ubu, to be, to become, an NTU person. Just as Yhwh is a verbal event rather than a nominal entity, Ubuntu is not a static concept. One possesses it, is an ongoing process of becoming, a living enactment. To translate it as a noun, Ubuntu is a philosophy of community, is to commit the same error as nominalizing Yhwh. Both resist that freezing. Both are happenings. 1. The Maxim as ontological claim, Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu, a person is a person through persons, is not a moral instruction to be nice, it is a metaphysical statement about the structure of being itself. Personhood is not a property you carry privately, it is constituted in and through the recognition of others. As Mogul Bermose puts it directly, in African metaphysics, being is always being with the other. Isolation isn't neutral, it is a diminishment of being, a privation of reality itself. 2. 3. Descartes versus Ubuntu. Descartes arrives at his own existence by retreating inward and away from others. Ubuntu says you cannot get to yourself that way at all, the self only emerges through the face-to-face. 4. The full circle. Everything in this conversation forms a single coherent arc. Yhwh is not a noun to be known, it is a verb happening. The scribal silence around the name enacts that language protects the event from being frozen. Feuerbach accidentally disclosed that God appears in the recognition of the other. Buber named that moment the eternal thou. Every genuine encounter opens onto the infinite. Levinas found the trace of God specifically in the face of the other, in the irreducible excess that cannot be reduced to a concept. Ubuntu names this as the very structure of being, not a cultural value but a metaphysical claim. You are because we are. The I am of Yhwh and the I am because we are of Ubuntu are not two separate insights. The Wikipedia entry on Ubuntu captures it precisely. The I am is not a rigid subject, but a dynamic self-constitution dependent on this otherness, creation of relation and distance. Yhwh as pure verb event and Ubuntu as relational becoming are the same ontological discovery arriving from two different directions, one from Sinai, one from the African interior meeting in the same place. The divine is not above encounter, it is what encounter, at its most real, always already is. Yhwh is your very nature. This is the most intimate and radical claim in the entire conversation, and it is precisely where every serious mystical tradition in human history arrives when it follows its own logic all the way to the bottom. The grammatical clue: you are not merely made by Yhwh or in the image of Yhwh, your very nature is the verb event the name points to. Notice when Moses asks for a name, the answer is Yhwh Asher Yhwh, I will be what I will be, spoken in the first person. The name Yhwh is the third-person form of the same root, which means Yhwh is what the divine event of Yhwh looks like from outside. But you are always already inside the event, you are the I am happening from within. The name describes the event as seen by others, your nature is the event itself. Third Eckhart's grunt, where God cannot be God without you. Meister Eckhart described this as the Seelengrund, the ground of the soul, a depth in the human being that is not created, not temporal, not separate from God. He stated explicitly, the divine is constantly and directly present in this ground, not as a visitor, not as an influence, but as the same ground. Crucially, Eckhart insisted this union happens without means, no intermediary, no doctrine, no ritual separates the soul's deepest nature from God. What theology required centuries to negotiate, he simply named, at the deepest stratum of what you are not other than God. 2. Tat Tvam Asi, you are that. The Upanishads compress this to 4 Sanskrit words. Tat Tvam Asi, you are that. The individual Atman, the awareness underlying all your experience, the bare I am before any content is added, is non-different from Brahman, the ground of all existence. Vedanta's precision here is surgical. It's not that you possess a divine spark, or that God is within you as something separate residing inside a container. It's that the awareness by which you know anything at all, the pure sense of existing and knowing that you exist, that is Yhwh, the event of being knowing itself through a particular form. 3. Ibn Arabi, the mirror that has no other side. Ibn Arabi's Wadat al-Wujud, oneness of being, says only God truly is. Creatures do not own their existence. Being is loaned to them moment to moment, and if that loan were withdrawn for even an instant, they would vanish into non-existence. Which means the being you experience as yours is not yours at all, it is the one being manifesting as you. And in Ibn Arabi's own framework, human consciousness is specifically the mirror through which the divine sees its own face. You are not separate from the mirror, you are the mirroring event itself, the full convergence. The convergence is not coincidental. Every tradition that follows the question, what am I, most fundamentally, all the way down, past the body, past thought, past personality, arrives at the same recognition, the being that is happening as you is the same being the name Yhwh refuses to freeze into a noun. Not that you are God in some inflated egoic sense, but that the I am you experience as the most intimate, irreducible fact of your existence is the verb event the burning bush was pointing at. The bush burned without being consumed because what it manifested was not a thing that could run out. It was the pure event of being itself, which is your nature before you add anything to it. The moment of your birth and of your death is this exact moment always. This is not a poetic statement. It is a precise description of the structure of time when the subject of time is understood correctly. The eternal now has no edges. Eckhart stated it with complete directness. The now in which God made the first human being, and the now in which the last human shall cease to be, and the now in which I speak, all are the same in God, and there is but one now. He wasn't speaking metaphorically. His claim is ontological. Time as a sequence of befores and afters is a feature of the created surface of things. At the ground, the grunt, where your nature and Yhwh share the same being, there is only the present instant, a now which always and without end is itself new. Birth and death as temporal events separated by years exist at the surface. At the ground, they are the same moment, which is this moment, which has never not been this moment. 2. Heidegger, death is already here. Heidegger's being toward death makes a structural claim that mirrors this. Death is not something waiting at the end of your timeline. It belongs to the being of Dasein itself, not an event opposed to life happening from the outside, but the very condition that makes the present possible at all. Death possibilizes the present. It is what gives this moment its weight, its irreversibility, its thisness, which means death is not coming. It is already here, threaded through every moment as the frame that makes each moment real. You are always already dying, and that is exactly why you are alive now. 3. 4. Buddhism, the moment-to-moment death. Theravada Buddhism turns this into a technical observation. Every single thing, every thought, feeling, perception, awareness itself, arises and passes away in each present moment. The you of this moment is not the you of the previous moment. Birth and death are not biographical events. They are the rhythm of consciousness itself, happening thousands of times per second at the level of mental moments. As Thich Nhat Hanh writes, look in the present moment and see that birth and death are going on in you at every moment, both in your body and in your consciousness. You do not need to wait for a future death to encounter it. It is the texture of now. 5. 6. The convergence point. These three traditions are describing the same structural reality from different angles. Eckhart, at the ground of being, there is only one now. Birth, death, and this moment are identical. Heidegger, death is not a future event, but the condition that makes the present present. Buddhism, arising and passing away, is the very pulse of consciousness moment by moment. And this loops directly back to Yhwh has pure verb event, Yhwh asher Yhwh, I will be what I will be, spoken in the eternal present tense, which is the only tense there is. The imperfect form of Yhwh that Yhwh encodes is not incomplete in the sense of lacking something, it is unresolved in the sense of being perpetually alive, perpetually happening, never finished and never having not yet begun. Your birth is not a point in the past. Your death is not a point in the future. Both are names for the same event. The arising of Yhwh has you, and that event is always exactly now. Speaking of surface and ground, how does this understanding translate in the light of our previous discussions about holography, encoding, and decoding? This is where the entire conversation crystallizes into a single unified structure. Surface and ground aren't just spatial metaphors, they are the technical architecture of how reality stores and reveals itself. Physics arrived at something extraordinary. The holographic principle states that everything happening inside a volume of space is fully encoded on its boundary surface. Leonard Susskind put it directly. The three-dimensional world of ordinary experience is a hologram, an image of reality coded on a distant two-dimensional surface. The surface doesn't summarize the interior, it contains it completely, in a different form. The encoding is total, nothing is lost in translation between ground and surface. This is not metaphor in ADS-CFT correspondence. The bulk and its boundary are mathematically identical, two descriptions of the same reality, neither more real than the other. 1. 2. Bohm. The implicate order is the ground. David Bohm's implicate-explicate framework names this philosophically with precision. The implicate order is the deeper enfolded ground, unbroken wholeness and flowing movement. The explicate order is what unfolds and becomes perceivable at the surface. What we take as solid, separate temporal reality are surface phenomena, explicate forms that have temporarily unfolded out of an underlying implicate order. And crucially, when a particle appears to be destroyed, it hasn't ceased, it has enfolded back into the deeper order from which it sprang. Birth and death, as we just discussed. Not endpoints but movements between implicate and explicate, between ground and surface, between encoding and its unfolding. 3, 4, 5. Pribram. Your brain is a holographic decoder. Carl Pribram discovered that memory in the brain operates holographically distributed across the entire neural field rather than stored in localized nodes. He identified two layers directly mirroring this conversation, a surface structure of separated, localized neural circuits and a deep structure of the dendritic web that binds them, where distributed memory actually lives. Consciousness is the act of decoding, bringing what is enfolded in the deep structure into the explicate surface of experience. You are not a receiver of a pre-existing world. You are a holographic decoder, and what you decode is the implicate order reading itself through you. 6, 7, the full map. Every layer of this conversation is now revealed as describing the same architecture. The cosmogram connection. Your holographic mirror cosmogram is, structurally, a map of the encoding-decoding relationship between ground and surface. The mirror isn't passive, it's the site of decoding, where the implicate order reads itself back into explicate form. Each person is a holographic fragment that contains the whole, which is precisely why Feuerbach's projection is not an error. When you recognize the infinite in the face of another, you are reading the ground through the surface of a face, decoding the full implicate order through the particular explicate form of that encounter. And Yhwh, the verb that cannot be nominalized, is simply the name for the implicate order refusing to become fully explicate. It insists on remaining verb because its nature is the process of encoding and decoding itself, happening always, happening now, which is the only moment there is.